Professional work, then, in any clinical setting demands a personal relationship, whether the individual practitioner acknowledges that relationship or not. There are some therapists, as you know, that feel that the relationship probably doesn't matter, but the fact is they're involved in a relationship. Our professional choices manifest, then, our personal ways of working. Some therapists choose to ignore the relational dimension altogether, while other therapists choose to focus on it for a while. But all highly skilled, seasoned professionals are acutely aware of what's going on in the relationship at all times and are carefully aiming their work into the relational matrix. And I've got a few examples here. I once had the pleasure of watching Virginia Satir work. This was in the Midwest in a large gymnasium kind of setting with several hundred therapists gathered around for a weekend conference. And she is out in the middle of this gymnasium on a dais, and she's going to do family therapy in front of all of us. So she's got a mother and a father, a really sullen teenage boy, and a sweet little girl. And she starts off like usual, asking a few questions. The identified client is this sullen teenage boy. So as Virginia Satir gets going, she first tries one thing, and then she tries another and tries another. And we're all sitting on the edge of our seat thinking, you got 200 people watching you, and you're a world-famous family therapist, what's going to happen if you can't get this off the ground? So we're waiting and waiting, and she's working and working and working, and she's really struggling hard, and all of a sudden, she bursts into tears, and she looks at this kid, and she says, "You are really hurting my feelings. I'm working very hard to try to get you to say the things that your parents need you to hear, and I'm going to try to help you get them to hear, and you're not helping me." Well, the whole thing was so sincere, and it came from a point. She was struggling and she was hurting. It changed it around. The kid immediately starts cooperating and starts talking about things, and we saw a very good family therapy session. But it was perfect empathy. She was right with that child and felt it, and at some point she felt the hurt and the pain and then moved on with it. I once heard Joseph Volpe, the very famous behavior therapist, work, and he described a case of a little 7-year-old girl that he'd been working with, and her symptom was she would cut out paper dolls. So wherever she'd go, she'd start folding up paper and start cutting out paper dolls. So at school and at home and the babysitters and everywhere, they tried to get her to stop cutting out paper dolls, but she wouldn't. And finally, they took her for behavior modification to Volpe. Well, he sat down on the floor with her, and sure enough, she had found the paper and the scissors and began cutting out paper dolls. And he tried this, and he tried that, and he tried something else. And as he's zeroing in on her, finally at one point he stands up and he looms over her and he says, "Stop cutting out paper dolls." And she did. Now, who knows what told Volpe to do that, but in some way or another, that child needed to feel something that was in his voice and in his style and his mannerism, and it was perfect empathy that allowed him to do that. I watched another thing of Alexander Lowen once. I don't know how many of you have been to body psychotherapy conferences, but they're utterly fascinating because they're different, very different from most of our psychoanalytic conferences. In the body, a group of body therapists get together, and they're, of course, in their sweatshirts and running shoes, and they're stretching against the walls and pumping up and down, and they're just a very lively, body-oriented kind of group. But then typically what they do is they gather in a large circle around who's going to be the training guru. And this happens in there's 40 different schools of body psychotherapy in this country, but the one that I know best is bioenergetics. So they gather around, and so on this particular day, the therapists gathered around. There were maybe 100 of them, and Al Lowen is out in the middle, and he starts talking about just a few things that are coming to his mind that day that interest him. And then he says, "Who wants to work?" This is the way body therapists train. Who wants to work? And hands go up, and he says, "You." And this guy comes forward. It's this big, burly guy, big, strong neck, chest. And Al says, "Well, okay, what do you want to work on?" And Al kind of while they're having this little conversation, is turning around, looking at him, watching his body, reading his body, and it turns out that he has problems managing his anger, and he wants to work on that. He's an ex-cop, and in the course of duty, he has killed 3 people single-handedly with his bare hands in the line of duty. So he's potentially quite a brute, a strong man, a big man. Al's this little wiry guy, and Al starts pushing at him and agitating him. And at some point, he's right up in front of him, and he's flipping on his chest. And we're all thinking, dude, you're going to get your lights punched out, stop. Because it was scary, realizing that what Al was up against. And right at one moment, this man crumples to the floor in a heap, sobbing, "Father, please don't beat me anymore." Perfect empathy. Okay. These examples I've given you were master therapists. They knew how to go after exactly what was needed to allow for the proper breakdown. Each of these gifted therapists knew what to do. I've also, even one of the founders of cognitive behavioral therapy, Alan Beck, after reviewing all of the neuropsychological literature, describes the crucial aspect of the relationship in psychotherapy. See, he's got an interesting quote. Quote, "The therapeutic relationship is a key ingredient in all psychotherapies, including cognitive therapy. Many of the basic interpersonal variables common to other psychotherapy, that is warmth, accuracy, empathy, unconditional positive regard, serve as an important function for cognitive and symptomatic change." So that really, any really gifted therapist is fully aware of the importance of the relationship. So the conclusion is, by now, since the relationship is key, we need to always be asking the question of the relationship, what's happening here anyway? What's going on here? And that's the Stephen Mitchell question. What's going on here anyway? All right, so I want to go to some background considerations. And at first it'll seem strange why I'm going to these backgrounds, but I think it'll slowly become clear. Neuroscience and the brain-heart functioning. We've learned more about human beings and about our biological nature in the last 2 decades than we've known since the beginning of time. Technology has given us all sorts of information and answers. We now know that we are a relational species, that our brains and our nervous systems actually become structured early in life, throughout our lifespan, by the relational opportunities that are presented to us. How scientists have come to review these is very interesting. We've got a lot of very interesting books now, very readable ones. Marguerite and I have been exchanging books for some time about neuropsychology. There are 6 distinctly different views of brain that have emerged over time. The first one is the one that we all know, that we studied, split brain and localization, going back to experiences in war zones and to Phineas, who had a railroad spike go through his head. The whole idea is, if there's someone with a brain injury, if we can look to see how that particular injury to this part or this part or this part affects their functioning, we'll understand what parts of the brains function to do what pieces. So the whole idea of localization. Now, at this point in time, we've gone well past that, so that localization, in a certain sense, remains pretty much part of the past, although it is now being revived in England by McGilchrist with some whole new understandings about the right and the left brain. And his book is The Master and His Emissary. And he thought that we've always thought that the master was the left brain and the right brain was the emissary, and he's making a very strong case for it being the other way around. We are first and foremost relational and emotional, and that's the master, and that the servant or the emissary is the left brain. So that's a very interesting, and his work is quite good. He's at the cutting edge. The second theory that we all know about is the triune brain. provided to us by Paul MacLean through his work at the National Institute of Health. The reptilian brain, the mammal brain, the primate brain. Now, MacLean knew there was a fourth brain, but the technology at the time that he was doing his research did not allow him to determine that the fourth brain, the prefrontal cortex, actually did anything. Now, he had some vague sense that it had to do, and since it was unique to our species, basically, that it had to do with higher social functions or moral judgments or something. So he called these the angel lobes. But that was as far as his research could get him. We now, through brain studies, particularly the work of Alan Shore, we've been able to look at the prefrontal cortex. It's linked through the orbital frontal lobes, and to realize that this part of our brain is activated immediately following birth, presumably for the purpose of learning about relationships. And there's a second growth spurt at age 15, presumably to learn about peer relationships in that particular era. This has been long known as the third eye in Asia. And when we go back to ancient Egypt, we realize from the Sphinx at Gaza that the goddess that controlled the Sphinx, the hooded serpent, the ancient symbol for the goddess was always the hooded serpent, and it was on the forehead of the Sphinx. Now, during World War I rifle practice, some of the Germans shot the goddess off, so those of you who have visited cannot see her, but you'll be happy to hear the goddess is alive and well at the Luxor Hotel in Las Vegas. So, sitting right in the front is the Great Sphinx with the hooded serpent, the third eye, the prefrontal cortex. For well over 4,000 years, we've understood that this is where the divine spirit of the human being exists, right here. Then the next theory of brain, for which Gerald Edelman won the Nobel Prize, was the idea of reentry. The reentry brain is basically, he was able to establish that there are interconnections throughout all parts of the brain, such that the brain is at all moments functioning as a single unit and functioning also with all of the neurological and endocrinological systems in our body and even systems beyond our body. That it is a single organismic unit. From here, on this side of my brain, there are connections that run over, down, under, through, across, so that all parts of the brain and the nervous system are dynamically connected. And he has called this the re-entry brain, where connections re-enter and re-enter and re-enter until we have a totally functioning whole. The fourth main theory of brain functioning is Joseph Ledoux and what he has called the synaptic brain. Now, we all studied neurons in high school and college, and at that point in time, the metaphor that was used was sort of like the telephone switchboard with little wires running all around, and right at the synapses there were electrochemical impulses that would jump from one to the other. And so we were born sort of with almost a tabula rasa, and through conditioning all of these things were learned. Well, at this point in time, that is certainly a dinosaur. The model that we're using now is more like the human mind is a large cosmos. And in this